Hello and a huge welcome to all of you joining us today for Food Diversity Day. My name is Polly Russell and I'm a food historian and I work at the British Library, and I am thrilled to be hosting this first session for this fabulous day. We've got a packed schedule, 11 events exploring food diversity on topics from cities to drinks to grains to cheese and many, many more. You're going to be hearing from food producers, from chefs, from historians, from farmers, from campaigners and from scientists. Now, if you want to find out more about the schedule, go to the Food Diversity Day website. That's dansaladino.com/food/diversity day to look what's happening. Now, today is all about understanding and celebrating diversity. This is the start of a conversation. It is not the end. We want today to be the first in, we hope, an annual event, but much more important, we want to also galvanize action and initiative across a range of scales, from the most personal to the global. Sessions are going to be running from 9 until 7, and in that final session we're joined back with this panel where we are going to try, working with all of you, to come up with a manifesto for diversity action. Now feel free to join in all of the events. You can stick with us all day. We hope that you do. It's fine to settle in for that, but it's also okay to jump in and out in sessions as your schedule allows. So for this first session, we need to get going because we've only got 45 minutes, and we are going to be delving into some of the really big ideas and themes of the Food Diversity Day. We're going to ask a really key question. Why does food diversity matter? And we're going to answer this question with a fantastic panel of experts. As we're talking, if you have questions, do put them in the chat. I'm not sure we will get round to all of them in this session, but we will certainly come back to them at the end of the day, and they'll help us form our thinking throughout. So we're going to start with really where it all started, and that is the reason that we're here, and that is with Dan Saladino. Let me tell you.
Good morning, Polly. Good morning, everyone.
Hi. This is really exciting, isn't it?
Very exciting. And yeah, as you mentioned, a day in which we can all gather and celebrate food diversity, raise the profile of endangered foods, foods at risk of extinction, and look at some positive solutions of what we can all do to help save them.
That's right, Dan. Let me just tell people a little bit about you in case they don't know. You are a journalist and a broadcaster. You make programmes about food for BBC Radio 4's The Food Programme. Your work's been recognised by the Guild of Food Writers, the Fortnum and Mason Food and Drink Awards, and in America by the James Beard Foundation. You're the brainchild behind Food Diversity Day, and that has been inspired in large part by this fabulous book, Eating to Extinction, The World's Rarest Foods and Why We Need to Save Them. Everyone needs a copy of this, so go out and buy it if you don't already have it. So let's start with that book, Dan, and can you quickly say, why did you write Eating to Extinction, and then how does Food Diversity Day fall out of that?
Well, when I started to focus on food and farming as a journalist, very quickly I came across something called the Ark of Taste, which is an online catalogue of endangered foods created by Slow Food, which has grown to a list of 5,500 endangered foods around the world from 150 different countries. As a journalist, and this is around 15 years ago, the first thing that happened was I just fell in love with these stories. They took me to a different part of the world, into a community, huge amounts of fascinating food history. So why did that food exist in that particular place? And then why did it have cultural importance, significance for the people there over potentially thousands of years? Then what the important question, why was it endangered? Why was it disappearing? And the last part of that, why should we care? And so I spent years and years telling or collecting these stories of endangered foods, and I must admit, it was a storytelling exercise. I just thought they were beautiful stories of food diversity around the world. When I wrote the book, that was my opportunity to do a deeper dive into how did this amazing diversity come into existence in the first place, as we'll hear through many of the sessions. In seed banks around the world, for example, hundreds of thousands of varieties of different types of wheat and maize and rice and 1,000 other crops as well. So how did that come into existence? How did diversity spread around the world? And then the bit, that deep dive was, how did, in such a short space of time, particularly in the last 100 or so years, how did that diversity disappear? And why is it that the food system become more uniform, more homogenous? And why should we care about things that people would describe as a food tradition? You know, is that something that's just a quaint part of our food history, or does that have value for the future? And in writing the book, I reached the conclusion that these aren't quaint traditions. These are amazing genetic resources that actually crop scientists are working with today to produce more resilience. They are culturally important as well. Do we really want to live in a world in which we're all watching the same films, wearing the same fashion designs, listening to the same music and eating the same food? I think part of the human experience is that sense of place where we are in the world being reflected through food and drink. And that's why I wanted to tell these stories, because I believe they're important for the future of our food, and they're also important in terms of what does it mean to be human.
So let me just be a bit challenging and perhaps head off, and perhaps people thinking, which is that how can you say that there's a lack of diversity when we seem to have more choice than ever?
Which is an absolutely valid point to make. And you might be saying, and I can say, I can experience far more food diversity than my parents or my grandparents did. The point that I'm making, it's the same kind of diversity that's spreading around the world. So we are having a more common experience wherever we are in the world, and whatever time of year, we can have this same food experience. And that's what I'm trying to, I guess, question or challenge in the book. Is that a good thing, both, you know, in terms of our relationship with the planet, with nature? Should we neglect, forget, dismiss the idea that there are foods that belong in certain parts of the world because the environmental conditions created those foods? They are foods of a place. They are foods of a landscape, of an ecosystem, of thousands of years of experimentation by farmers in that location. And I think that's too precious and too valuable to dismiss and be replaced by this uniformity of diversity that's spreading around the world.
That's a great answer, and I know that the rest of our panelists will also be able to answer this, why diversity matters. Dan, before we go to the next panelist, Tim Benton, can you just give everybody a sense of what's coming up today, what they can expect, and how they might interact with the day and its kind of aims?
Well, again, I've mentioned that the main principles of this are to celebrate the diversity that's out there, and hopefully people are joining us from around the world who might know something of this story and perhaps something of the foods where they live, but hopefully not. Hopefully people are coming to this new. And so this is an opportunity to say there is amazing diversity out there, food stories and food experiences to experience and to be part of. And that's the second idea, is that following these sessions, we want these to be a call to action. For people to engage and become part of this mission to celebrate and save food diversity. So we have, there will be some foods that are missed. Somebody at an event last night mentioned, is there chocolate? I'm not sure if there is. I hope somebody will be raising chocolate as a story or an example of genetic diversity. However, at 10 o'clock, for example, we're going to be talking about bread, baking, grains. I mentioned seed banks. There are more than 200,000 varieties of wheat stored in the Svalbard seed vault. Why are they not out there being grown by farmers? That will be explored in that session. Then we have seed saving, how we can all, even with a small plot of land or bit of soil, become creators of future diversity. There are sessions with chefs. So we have Michael Keynes, Kwasi Mensah, who's going to be joining us from Ghana, who's going to be talking about, can restaurants and menus be a key to communicating food diversity to us, people who love food? The oceans. Why is it that so many parts of the world, particularly Europe, focus on just 5 species of fish? What else is out there? Why is that a problem? We're going to be celebrating pulses, peas, beans, and lentils, and hearing from people who've revived some of the lost pulse traditions around the world, so from the States and also different parts of Europe. Why cities matter as well. So we're going to be talking about how schools have found ways of sourcing diversity and the importance of markets as well. So amazing farmers markets networks around the world today. And then we save the best to last in many cases. So we finish on cheese and drink. So we're going to be hearing about cheese diversity. We're going to be hearing about wine, beer, and a tiny sip of mezcal as well.
I think some people might want chocolate in there as well.
Chocolate, I promise you, we'll find a way of bringing chocolate into a conversation.
But what a fantastic day. What a great lineup. I'm already seeing some wonderful comments in the chat, people from really diverse backgrounds with different experience, all talking about the importance of stories, the importance of culture, and saying thank you for having this day. So I think this is going to be a great conversation. Everybody keep the chat going, because we will save this chat.
Yeah.
Our thinking will inform our discussions and inform what we do in the future. Dan, thank you very much for that summary and that roundup. And I want to go next to Tim Benton, Professor Tim Benton, to get a sort of global view, a macro view. Tim Benton is the Research Director at Chatham House and Professor at the University of Leeds. He's been one of the leading thinkers of developing the food systems approach and works on issues concerning the sustainability and resilience of food systems and delivering food systems that are better for people and the planet, both at the domestic and multinational levels. He's worked with many governments, the G20, the World Economic Forum, and has formerly been champion for the UK's Global Food Security Programme, working across governmental departments with an interest in food. He was the lead author on the IPCC's 2019 Food Report on Food, Land and Climate, and has been the lead author twice on the UK's climate change risk assessment, focusing on supply chain risks. So he is perfect to talk about the macro. Hi, Tim. So,
hello, Polly.
Hello. Let's start with you then. Can we start with that big question? Why does biodiversity matter? Food diversity matter? And can you give us some sort of concrete examples of the problems associated with biodiversity loss?
Yeah, I mean, huge topics, but I think 3 prime reasons for the food diversity issue being important. One is nutrition and health, that, as Tim will talk about, no doubt, in a minute, the underlying risks that come from us eating more or less the same thing all around the world. You know, 8 major commodities provide 3/4 of the world's calories. Means that we have access to far too much calories on an average basis, far too little nutrition, and the diseases associated with overconsumption of calories and poor nutrition are causing problems in health systems from the rich world to the poorest of the poor world. So diversity matters from a health perspective. Second, diversity matters from a resilience perspective. We're moving increasingly into a world where environmental threats are being thrown at us all of the time, from biodiversity loss itself and from climate change. So extreme weather, heat, wildfires, drought, floods, very heavy rainfall, sleet, hail that knocks crops down. And if you just grow the same crop, you've got all of your eggs in a single basket. So from a resilience perspective, we need diversity. And the third major reason is from a sustainability perspective. Most of what we grow, these 8 major commodity crops, are engineered in a way to be grown under super intensive nutrition conditions. So we grow them at a very large scale in monocultures, put on lots of nutrients. That all leads to a whole range of problems from a biodiversity perspective. And the fact that we have these big monocultures means that there's increasingly less space for nature to live. And if we grow a diversity of foodstuffs, at least that gives places in the landscape where different things are being grown, where there's different suitability for birds or whatever it might be. So 3 principal reasons. And just in terms of why it matters, well, I mean, I've clearly kind of touched on that above, but I think one of the key things that we're increasingly worrying about is that if we're just growing everything at very large scale in not cutting down rainforests to produce palm oil, etc. We are intensively rewiring ecosystems, coupled with climate change causing different animals and plants to live together in different ways. And that is increasingly leading to outbreaks of pests and diseases. And almost certainly, COVID was made more likely because of environmental change and rewiring of ecosystems, putting animals that don't normally live together into close proximity, and diseases that are obviously designed, pathogens are obviously designed from an evolutionary perspective to seek new hosts. So you would expect when you mix new animals in new communities because of environmental change, that you would expect pests and diseases to outbreak. And whether it's zoonoses, diseases from animals, or whether it is pests of plants like rusts and all the rest of that, it's a danger to grow uniformity.
So, I mean, that's sort of dazzling and overwhelming. In 2-3 minutes, you've just compressed these kind of vast problems. Can you just, I mean, I'm a historian, so I'm going to ask this question. Just can you give us a sense of to what extent this is a contemporary modern problem, and how did we get here? What's the kind of evolution of this disaster? And if you could do that fairly quickly.
Yeah. So basically, since the Second World War, we have effectively designed our food systems on the basis that we need more food in the world. And that rhetoric is still there. We have to grow more food because there are people that are starving in the world. And what this has done is through liberalization of trade, creating global markets and investing in crops that are easy to grow, we have driven over the last 60 or 70 years a system that incentivizes large-scale production, and in a few breadbasket regions. And as you look for the volume of volumes, you narrow down to grow those crops in large scales in areas where you can grow them. So that leads to the 7 or 8 breadbaskets growing the 7 or 8 crops around the world on which the whole global consumption system is now based.
Right. And I think that paints, in a way, that picture you painted is sounding pretty depressing. But to what extent are there things that we can do? Do you feel optimistic? Are there ways that we can reshape and restore diversity that will feed the world and also save the environment, improve our health? Can you just, with your global perspective, can you give us a sense about that?
Yeah, I think the key thing from my perspective is that we produce an excess of calories at a price that in many markets means that it's economically rational to waste and to overconsume. If instead we designed our system around providing a healthy diet, the right amount of foods, the diversity of foods, the footprint associated with that diet would go down. We could have a diversity of production systems. We could use agroecological approaches. We could provide sufficient food for a global healthy population, but only if we are willing to change our diets and eat less and eat more of the right sorts of things in diversity. So for me, the future is about aligning our dietary health and our planetary health and making sure that the global markets reward growing the right things in the right way, sustainably, and for a nutrition outcome.
So these are kind of huge structural policy answers, but they're also very personal, individual choices as well. So again, across a range of scale, we can be making some differences and pushing towards these big changes, is what I'm hearing.
Yeah, but I think just briefly, we do tend to think about the solution is in personal choice, but I think as with tobacco or as with oil consumption, I think the solution is getting the incentives of the market right to make the better more available and cheaper, and the worse less available and more expensive. Because, in answer to your earlier question to Dan about the paradox of diversity, yes, the rich can get hold of a vast diversity of stuff, but for the bulk of poor people in the world, they have to rely on very, very, very narrow diets because it's a thing that's available for the rich. And what we need to do is develop agricultural incentives that reward growing diversity, make diversity cheaper, and make the sorts of things that the lack of diversity makes cheaper at the moment, make that more expensive.
Thank you for clarifying that point, making that very important political point. There is so much fabulous chat going on. This is already a wonderful conversation, I can see. I want to turn now, in a sense, from the macro down to the micro, and turn to Professor Tim Spector. Hi, Tim. Tim is an OBE. He's an award-winning scientist and author with over 1,000 original articles published in some of the world's top scientific journals. He's in the top 1% of the most cited scientists on the planet. His book, Spoon-Fed, offers the latest evidence on food science and personalized nutrition, the impact of our food environment, and how profits and policy impact our dinner tables with a pragmatic and real-life approach. Tim's upcoming book, Food for Life, is his most extensive yet, taking an in-depth look at the latest scientific evidence on what we eat, how we eat, and why, and how we can use this knowledge to improve our own personal nutrition. So it won't be too long because we want him to get on and finish that book, which is going to be brilliant. So Tim, can we start with you by you explaining how the kind of new science of gut microbiology is changing our understandings of diet and nutrition, and how this is linked to food diversity, please?
Yeah, and an update, the book is out there already, so you can actually buy it for the last month. But the so the details, if people do want to look, there is now a place to look. I wrote this book really as a practical guide for people to understand food from a sort of microbial health perspective, but also an environmental impact perspective as well. So for the first time, trying to take a more holistic view of how people choose their food. And that really hasn't been available. But I think this whole field has been opened up really by the discovery of the microbiome that changed the way I think we think about food, and how it suddenly links with the planet and the soil and our health in this similar way, because of our very close relationship with other organisms like microbes. And the link between diversity of foods and health has come to light really. And a pivotal study we did about six or 7 years ago, when we took 11,000 people from the British Gut Project, which was just a sort of charity survey, and the American Gut Project. We look at all their gut microbes, and we gave them questionnaires about whether they were vegan, vegetarian, meat eaters, on an American diet, British diet, whatever it was, and looked at their gut health. And we measured gut health, interestingly. Good gut health is measured by the degree of diversity of species. So similar way to we're talking about, a healthy planet has diverse species. So inside us, the more diverse the species of microbes are, the better we are. And that's mainly talking about bacteria, but we now know that's also fungi, it's parasites, it's viruses, etc. And the key finding was not really whatever everyone thought. Oh well, it'll just be the vegans that always win. They have the healthiest gut health. But it turned out it was the sweet spot was people who reported eating 30 different types of plant in a week. And that was regardless of whether they were meat eaters, vegans, pescatarians, vegetarians, or gluten-free. It really didn't matter, as long as what was on your plate were these diverse range of plants. And remember, what we're talking a plant is it includes nuts, it includes seeds, and it includes herbs and spices. So it's very much a different way of looking at food, and it's a combination. And we think the reason for this is a combination of the fiber, the different fibers they have, and the defense chemicals in the plants, the polyphenols. And so it's sort of suddenly we're understanding why eating the rainbow actually was a good idea. It sounded like a slogan without really, any science, but it does turn out to be actually the reason, because these are all food for our gut microbes, which helps them proliferate and get a whole range of different species. And as an example, we found we found recently in the studies we're doing with the Zoe platform, we now got 50,000 people to look at, that we can detect coffee drinkers because there's a certain specific microbe called Lawsonobacter that only drinks coffee. Okay.
This is very good news.
Yeah, and which is different to a tea drinker or a green tea drinker. So this gives you an idea that just subtle differences in your diet will have major implications, and based, so this is very much why we need to be thinking about the chemicals in food, which differ by subspecies, by color, by all these things. And this means that you're then, these chemicals are having a different effect on your microbes, which will make some proliferation, others die down. And that's why the opposite is also true, so that the least diverse diets end up with shrinking down your gut microbes. And we think that's what's happened in the last 50 to 100 years. We've lost about half of our gut microbes.
And so, Tim, what's the consequence of that, of this, and what do you see in terms of gut health with kind of contemporary, modern, highly industrialized diets? What are the consequences that we can extrapolate from?
Well, all the studies done in the last 10 years have clearly shown that a loss of diversity and what we call now poor gut health is associated with nearly every common modern disease that you can name. And particularly strong are its links with food allergies, which didn't exist 50 or 60 years ago. We're talking lots of autoimmune diseases. We're talking things like irritable bowel syndrome, which didn't exist, but also increases in diabetes, cancer, heart disease. Pretty much everything is associated with a dysfunctional gut microbiome. And it all, because the microbes basically are like chemical factories. They're converting the chemicals in food into chemicals that the body can use. They're interacting with the immune system, and if they're not working well, that immune system will fail, and you get more cancers that aren't being detected early. You accelerate aging. You don't have this anti-inflammatory effect, which was sort of dampening down our immune system, and this has all kinds of other consequences, and including on mental health. I mean, rates of depression are huge in the Western world, and a lot of that is due to the gut microbes and the food they're being fed. So this is really important. And you look at our ancestors, hunter-gatherers, people like Ozzy the Iceman, even these coprophiles, these little fecal pellets you find in sites, totally different to our gut microbes. Now, they had lots of healthy parasites that only a few of us still have. So we're killing off our gut microbes as we're reducing our plant diversity.
So the message here is about eating a broad range, a wide range of plant-based foods, and so diversity of diet for individual health is absolutely crucial.
It's the number one thing in terms of advising people on a healthy diet now, and I think we should abandon this 5 a day nonsense, which hasn't worked. Nobody followed it, and they just had the same bit of synthetic orange juice or whatever it was. It sort of reduced that diversity. And of course, the other thing we haven't talked about is, our diets are now swamped by ultra processed foods, and it's 57% of our diet now comes from ultra processed food. It's over 70% in children, and that is also, not only is it really bad for our gut microbes, makes us hungrier for the same amount of calories, but I think that is contributing also to the lack of diversity, because you can create these ultra processed foods from pretty much anything just by adding a few extra magic chemicals to make it taste like the original, but it doesn't actually provide the microbes with any real nutrients or energy or fiber.
Thank you for reminding of us of that. Tim, can I ask you very quickly, because I think there's a kind of theme here emerging, because really what you're talking about in a way is about individual change, perhaps, but I feel there might be a theme emerging between this kind of individual versus structural, and which Tim talked about at the end. To what extent do you see this is something that individuals are responsible for, or is it actually a kind of bigger structural food producers, governments need to be making changes as well? Can I just ask you 30 seconds to reflect on that, just so we pick that theme up?
Well, I think individuals can make a big change. They can influence what are in the shops and in the markets. And if they start demanding, ways to get their 30 plants a week, we will see a shift in that demand. But it takes government to say, let's have that, let's abandon the 5 a day idea, and let's go for this diversity idea as a way of promoting health, realize that they've gone wrong, make a big change. That would make a bigger, faster change than the personal approach. But I do think both are important.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Tim. So our last panelist today is Melissa Thompson, and I think she's the perfect person to bring in here, because having a cultural, historical perspective around why diversity matters is absolutely in her wheelhouse, and also, of course, because of pleasure and taste and enjoyment around food. So hi, Melissa. Melissa, for those of you who don't know, runs the food and recipe project Foul Mounds. Former newspaper journalist, in 2014, she started a supper club in her front room that eventually grew into a sellout pop-up, which only ended after the birth of her daughter in 2018. She's been a vocal advocate for the promotion of Black and minority ethnic people in food, and now provides advice on all aspects of the industry. She's a BBC Good Food columnist, the Kitchen Cabinet panelist, and writes for The Guardian, Condé Nast, National Geographic, and others. Her book, Motherland, a Jamaican Cookbook, topped many of the best food book lists from 2022. Hi, Melissa.
Hi, Polly. Hi, everyone.
In Motherland, which is a fabulous book, you show how a recipe or an ingredient can reveal so much about history and a people. Can you talk a bit about why that was important for you to tell those stories, and how you would connect that to this question of food diversity? And perhaps I'd love it if you can draw out the story of the Taino, the Jamaican indigenous population, and questions of colonialism. Thanks.
So for me, I guess Motherland started as me wanting, it was a book that I was looking for a long time. I wanted a story that takes in the history and runs it alongside the food, because I think for me, context is really important in food, and understanding where food comes from, where recipes come from, and the circumstances in which ingredients were grown or recipes were created. And that book didn't exist, and so I wrote it. And I think it bothered me, for instance, that I knew the origins of tartare, and yet as someone who has Jamaican ancestry, I didn't know the origins of ackee saltfish. I knew kind of the very kind of bare bones of it, and so then that started as the project. It was always going to be a cookbook, a recipe book, but then also alongside that, talk about these stories. And then I guess it evolved. It became a bit more personal as well, kind of writing, I guess, some of the historical wrongs or some of the common narratives that we're fed in the West about things that happened in the Americas. And of course in Jamaica, to do with the transatlantic slave trade, with colonialism. And I think that those lies have trickled down to where we are today, where there's this hierarchy in food, where certain foods are deemed better, they're seemed more they're almost seem cleverer, that they're kind of, there's more ingenuity in them, where to me some of the the origins of maybe oxtail or curry chicken or ackee and saltfish, these dishes that were created in unimaginable conditions, and yet they have survived. And we talk about Columbus and things like that, and when I was growing up, Columbus was deemed this kind of really incredible explorer who discovered the Americas, and that would really, I'll mind my language, but it would really annoy my dad when we were sitting there as a kid. He'd be like, how can someone discover something when people were already living there? so that was quite pleasing to be able to right some of those wrongs, or that, you know, the indigenous populations died because of a lack of immunity to these new diseases that the Europeans were bringing over, which was true to an extent, but actually the thing that really hurt them was the violence, the savagery of Europeans. And obviously, you know, again, growing up, savagery was always a word that was more associated with people of my kind of background. I do have a European background as well, but I'm sort of half Maltese and half Jamaican. And the Taino, the kind of indigenous Jamaicans, the red ware people, and then they became assimilated into the Taino, and they were who Columbus and his fleet met when they went to the Caribbean. And it's straight off the bat, the Columbus knew what he wanted to do. He wanted them to be their servants. He wanted to convert them into Christianity, and it started just a massive program of enslavement, murder, and, you know, other sort of really horrible things. And because the Taino were pretty much killed off in such a short period of time, there is very little about their culture that survives. And yet we have these flatbreads, bami, where the Taino didn't have a written language, but the very first Europeans, and some of them who were actually very sympathetic to the Taino and against the Spanish, spoke about these cassava flatbreads, and they still survive today as bami. And for me, like, so every time I eat bami, and I have it with sort of often with escovitch fish, so on the plate you've got the escovitch, which is a legacy of the Spanish, on a plate, and you have them with bami, these flatbreads that are from the indigenous population, and I find that really special, because I find it heartbreaking what happened to them and what happened to their culture. They kind of had a diet of sweet potato, of maize, and cassava. Cassava was so important to them that they actually worshipped, one of their goddesses was dedicated to cassava. And so for me, things like that are so important, and it shows the importance of food and being able to celebrate culture, history, people, and the movement of people, right? You know, all around the world, we have all these different dishes and food cultures that tell so much more about ingredients. They tell about kind of the sort of the history, culture, kind of the sort of like anthropology of time and a space. And I find that really, really important. And for me, and look at America and Britain, right? Because for a long time, I think people said those countries lacked a food culture, which I don't really think is true. And I think it is a bit unfair. But now, you know, where we are now is a moment in history. So in 200 years time, I'll be like, oh, you know, kind of like this was the food culture in England. And it's, you know, a lot of people bemoan, especially kind of the press, bemoan this idea of multiculturalism, and yet what it's done for our diet and increasing the diversity, and also celebrating cultures that for so long have just been deemed to be kind of unimportant. And so that for me is the real driver. And obviously I do a lot of work with trying to promote kind of more Black chefs, and more, you know, this idea of a Black food culture, which kind of as a concept is quite problematic, because it almost sounds quite homogenous, but, you know, you get what I mean when I say that. But then also in terms of class, because I think that, going back to the regional diversity of British food, you know, there are so many interesting things that have happened historically that again tell of a time. And I think that's really important. And one other thing I'd say as well, and just in terms of celebrating cultures that haven't been celebrated enough, a lot of the things that we celebrate today in Britain, this like idea of nose-to-tail eating, or, you know, this current kind of like wave of veganism, have been happening around the world for a long time. And yet, if an alien was to land in England, they would almost think that veganism started in West London like 10 years ago. Do you know what I mean? And so for me, that's why food diversity is important, because it teaches us about people, about movement, and also it makes things more interesting. For me, that's the bottom line, because food can be so inward looking and boring, and it really, I don't understand why it should be like that, because it's so fascinating. And you know, I love trying something new, and I love speaking to someone who tells me a story about growing up somewhere, like from wherever it is around the world. And you know, I once spoke to a woman who told me about, I was talking to her about suya, kind of sort of Nigerian barbecue from the north of the country, And she was like, yeah, you know, getting into trouble. She used to spend all her school money on the suya, which she's meant to be spending it on school. She was like, I knew I'd get into loads of trouble, but I didn't care because the suya tastes so good. And it was such like a little snippet, because I know suya, but only from a London perspective. And to hear someone talk about it and give me this like description of eating it kind of, you know, in the market, oh man, it just enriches. And so that's why I think diversity is really vital.
Melissa, I feel like that's like a rallying cry, which kind of pleasure and joy and curiosity are at its heart and are so important. I think this point about thinking of food as a cultural artifact in the same way that we think about art or architecture or, I don't know, you know, artifacts you find in fact, food is the story of ingenuity, of survival, of creativity, of extraordinary sort of human qualities across time, and absolutely to make those connections and remember is so important, and to celebrate. And so that's why your book, which does such a phenomenal job of connecting your own biography with these kind of really broader complex history and politics, is so important in reminding us why we have to question what's behind the food and understand it, to kind of really celebrate it, and then also want to save it as well. So that, thank you so much. I can see from the unbelievable chat that this is kind of, everybody is just dying to jump in and have a conversation, which is really exciting. I know that we could have talked we could have had the whole day just with this panel, so we could have done that. We are coming back at the end of the day just to remind everybody. I'm sorry that we don't have more time to delve into and to draw questions out of these fantastic speakers, but I think what you've all done, Tim, Dan and Melissa, is make really clear what is at stake here, that the loss of diversity matters across every scale, from the personal to the global, to the cultural, to the historical. It just does matter. You've each illustrated in different ways how the ecological, the biological, cultural are inextricably linked, and that the threat to diversity requires really urgent attention by individuals, but by governments, by manufacturers, by everybody that's involved. Well, everyone is involved in food because we all eat, so there we are, no one's off the hook. The good news, of course, I think, as everybody said in different ways, is that there are solutions. There are changes afoot already. There's a new way of thinking. This is part of that new way of thinking, and we're going to be hearing about that in the sessions which follow. It is nearly, Dan?
Yeah, I just wanted to say, after listening to Tim and Melissa, that I began this project in search of endangered foods, 15 or so years ago. And I think the conversation we've had today, that beginning that I had thinking, these are just beautiful stories and I want to tell these stories, but why do they matter? I think this conversation, in terms of the global politics and trade and economics and the nutrition and diet, and Melissa's brilliant explanation of why history and matters in this story. And I've just picked up on one comment which came in from Marilyn Pickup to say this is the UN International Year of Millets. I did write a chapter on millets in the book. It was taken out because there were too many stories. The book became too big. It was from India. And I was fascinated by these tiny grains that had disappeared from so many villages. It's the year of millets, and an attempt to bring back this diversity because of the extreme conditions that India experienced in the summer, of huge amounts of heat, lack of water, and there's a nutrient deficiency as well in the population. And the Indian government lobbied the UN to say, we want some support to bring back these endangered foods, this lost diversity, for the food security and the diets of the Indian population, more than 1 billion people. So what more do you need as an example of why diversity matters?
Fantastic example. Thank you. Thanks, Dan. And thank you for the person who put that in and reminded us all that was happening. It's nearly time for the next session, which will begin at 10 o'clock. So time for people to get a cup of tea and then come back and join us. It's going to be on baking, bread baking, and the glorious diversity of grains. Again, I want to thank this amazing panel. Remind you, we're going to be back at the end of the day at 7 o'clock. We're going to conjure up a manifesto for diversity and reflect on what's been discussed. And I thought perhaps we should let Eating to Extinction have the last word for this panel. Food diversity represents much more than sustenance, Dan writes in the book. It represents history, identity, pleasure, culture, geography, genetics, science, creativity and craft, and our future. So with that, let's end this panel. Let's go forth. See you all throughout the day. Thank you, everybody. See you this evening.